Daniel always found night drives calming. There was something soothing about long stretches of road, dark forests lining the edges, and the rare glow of oncoming headlights. For him, it was a time to think, disconnect from the day's chaos, and be alone with his thoughts. Tonight, he was driving home after a late visit to a friend in a neighboring town. The clock showed it was almost 2 a.m., and the road was deserted. The radio played softly in the background, filling the silence with mellow tunes. In the distance, the outline of a dense forest began to emerge, stretching endlessly along the highway. Forests always look strange at night. The trees seemed taller, their branches more twisted, as if warped by time. But Daniel had long since gotten used to these night drives through the wilderness. This time, however, something felt off. He didn't immediately understand what it was, but the unease crept under his skin. Glancing at the rearview mirror, he noticed his car's taillights reflecting differently. Something flickered in the darkness, barely perceptible. "Probably just overthinking," he muttered to himself, focusing back on the road. But the further he drove into the forest, the stronger the feeling became. An eerie sensation that someone or something was watching him. A few minutes later, Daniel noticed headlights in his rearview mirror. It was rare to see another car on this empty road. Someone was driving behind him, keeping a steady distance. At first, he thought it was just another late traveler. But after a few kilometers, the car was still there, maintaining the same gap. Daniel slowed down, giving the driver a chance to pass him. But the car behind him slowed as well. He sped up, and the headlights mirrored his pace. His palms grew sweaty. Just a coincidence, he thought, though deep down he didn't believe it. The headlights were too bright, almost blinding. Daniel decided to turn off the main road, veering onto a narrow dirt path, hoping the car behind him would simply continue straight. But the car followed. "Okay, maybe it's just a coincidence," he muttered, his voice trembling. He kept driving, taking more random turns, but the headlights never disappeared. They didn't get closer, but they didn't fall behind either. The panic inside him began to rise. Daniel tried to make out who was behind the wheel. Squinting into the rearview mirror, he strained to see the driver's silhouette. But the face behind the windshield was too dark, blending with the shadows. He couldn't discern any features or movement. The glaring headlights moved closer, nearly blinding him. A throbbing pain pulsed in his temples, and his slippery hands struggled to grip the wheel. "What do you want?" he shouted into the empty car, though he knew no one would answer. The headlights flickered. In that moment, Daniel noticed the road ahead narrowing. There were no signs, no intersections, just a thin path leading deeper into the forest. His chest tightened. The air inside the car seemed heavier, harder to breathe. Unable to take it anymore, Daniel slammed on the brakes. The engine cut off, and the sound of silence enveloped him. The headlights behind him turned off. He opened the door and stepped outside. The forest was impenetrably dark. The shadows consumed everything, and only the moonlight faintly illuminated the twisted trees, casting long, grotesque shadows. Behind him stood the car. Daniel squinted, trying to make out the driver. The doors were shut, the windows rolled up. No one got out. "Hey, what do you want?" he yelled, but the silence remained unbroken. A shiver ran down his spine, and instinctively he took a step back toward his car. Then he heard a creak. The door of the other car opened. A foot stepped out, followed by another. A tall man in a long coat emerged. His face was obscured by shadows, but something about his movements froze Daniel in place. The man didn't rush. He walked slowly, each step deliberate, closing the distance between them. "Stop. I'll call the police." Daniel fumbled for his phone, only to find there was no signal. The man continued to approach, stopping just a few meters away. "What do you want?" Daniel repeated, his voice trembling. There was no answer. The man raised his head, and Daniel finally saw his face, or rather, the lack of it. Where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been, there was only smooth, pale skin, as if it had been sculpted from wax. "You entered a forest that does not belong to you," a cold voice said, though the man's lips did not move. Daniel stumbled backward, his back hitting the car door. He wanted to run, but his legs felt rooted to the ground. "I don't understand. I was just driving home," he began, but the man's voice cut him off. "This is your home now." Suddenly, the shadows around him began to shift. The forest was coming alive. Tree branches stretched toward him like black hands, and the ground beneath him trembled. Daniel screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the thick, suffocating air. He tried to open his car door, but it was locked. Around him, rustling noises grew louder, footsteps that belonged to no one. The man stood motionless, yet his presence filled the entire space. "You will not return," the man said. "Everyone who enters becomes part of the forest." Daniel felt his legs sinking into the ground. His skin began to harden, growing rough and rigid like tree bark. He screamed again, but the sound grew weaker, like the wind rustling through leaves. When it was over, the forest fell silent once more. Where Daniel had stood, there was now a tree. Its branches resembled outstretched arms, and its bark looked eerily like human skin. The moonlight illuminated it as if mocking him. A few nights later, another car drove down the same road. A young woman, returning home, slowed her vehicle when she noticed a strange tree at the edge of the forest. It looked almost like a person, with a face frozen in a silent scream. She stopped to get a closer look, and in her rearview mirror, two bright headlights appeared.